Hello and welcome to the second Lights Out Racing podcast covering the Australian Grand Prix with me, Tony Knock, and my co-host Cole Brockwell. Okay, we're back and we're feeling good. Well, maybe I won't go as far as feeling good. At the moment, I'm feeling somewhere in between a hangover and jet lag after two very early mornings followed by a late night this weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. So am I. I'm very much in that point where my eyes are open, but I think my body wants to sleep. So, yeah, I think I think it's one of the very few races that we've got coming up in the short term anyway, where we're going to have to get up that time. But yeah, it was well worth
slightly
it.
more sociable next week with two 8 o'clock starts. So,
Yep.
So then, before we both fall asleep at the mic, I think we should crack on with the podcast. Okay, so moving on to the news roundup. The first story we'll be looking at is Robert Kubicas has returned to racing with WRC.
And Bernie Eccleston has reported to have said that a 22 race season is possible. We'll be discussing whether that really is and what the ramifications are if the calendar increased any more.
We'll be looking at a possible return for Honda as an engine supplier in the sport and the possibility that they may be supplying McLaren with their engines in the 2015 season.
Changes afoot at McLaren, where Vodafone will no longer be sponsoring them from 2014 onwards. We'll be looking at the potential ramifications for that and what the reasons were.
We'll have a look at where we think the future of F1 TV coverage is heading. Will it be free-to-air, pay-per-view, or maybe direct live streams? Okay, so that's the roundup finished. Now to have a look at the stories in a little more detail. The first one up we've got is Robert Kubicas competing in WRC this year.
Yeah, it's obviously, I think he still has some ability problems with his wrist or arm.
Yeah, I believe it's and the story was quoted as the whole thing. I think the right arm, hand, wrist, everything. So
yeah, so I'm quite interested to understand, how he's been getting on with that really, because obviously it seems like he's had dispensation to have a paddle gearbox.
Yeah, that's correct.
So I'm just sort of wondering, obviously, with Kubica being brought to come in, I mean, whether that was been given dispensation for him because of his history, or whether that is something which you can have normally as any driver really coming in. If he's good enough, then they'll make these adjustments.
I believe probably with that one it's going to be a little bit of both, because I think with Kubica his name carries a bit of weight. A former Formula One person going over to WRC is going to bring some viewers to WRC, so they're probably a bit more lenient there. But if he can show an actual need rather than a want for the flappy paddle gearbox as well, I should imagine that's going to make a big difference there.
Do you think he'll come back to F1?
I would like to think that the the stresses and strains that are going to be put on his body in WRC would give him some kind of idea of whether he'll be able to come back to F1 or not. But the problem I think he's going to have is going to be the fine motor skills for his fingers, like pushing the buttons, turning the knobs, and just doing the general holding on to the steering wheel under like the high loads in F1. I think that's where he may struggle a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm also thinking of is whether obviously you've got more protection as well, haven't you, in rallies, and obviously when we saw from the race last year where Grosjean went over the top of Alonso, nearly taking his hand out. You certainly don't want that, do you? Again, or risk of that happening again. So you're a little bit more exposed, aren't you?
I think the WRC cars themselves are very safe. There's a lot of padding, a lot of safety features in those. I think the problem is the tracks are less regulated. There's in F1 you've got barriers everywhere. In WRC you're very likely to end up in a ditch or a field. So
yeah, I mean, when would you say, in your opinion, when Kubica could come back, what would you say is the most feasible time?
I think if he can come back, if he can, I think he should be looking at around next year, maybe the year after. If he doesn't come back within the next 2 years, I don't think we're going to see him coming back.
I'm wondering whether he would go to a smaller team first, or whether perhaps he'd start testing for, say, Lotus, and then getting that way. I guess there's options.
Yeah, I would say probably the sensible option for him would be the reserve. He would go back to being the reserve driver for Lotus next year if he's ready to do it. Like I say, I just kind of get the feel he may struggle a little bit with just pushing the buttons and the fine details of the steering wheel, where he's going to need two hands for doing various different tasks.
It's a challenge because obviously you got a lot of the young drivers as well, and I suppose it's a debate for a team where do you have someone who's clearly had, from what I remember and what I've seen, historically, quite a highly abled F1 driver, or do you go with a young up and coming driver, that doesn't necessarily have to have those kind of accommodations? And that sounds harsh, but it's just one of those things. What would they consider?
I think the problem with Kubica is because of when his accident happened, he was a younger driver with a lot of potential, and now as he's not coming back, the years are slipping by. He's losing that younger driver with potential, and of course, for every year that goes by, he's also becoming race rusty in the F1 sense as well. So the longer he is out of it, the less likely it is looking that he's going to come back. I don't think we're going to see a return for him in 4 years or something like that. I think it has to be something that has to be in the very near future or not at all.
I'm not too sure when the World Rally Championships start, but I'm thinking that obviously if he has a very good championship, then obviously I think the rumours could increase. And if, for example, I don't know, Grosjean or another driver that's had challenges in the last year, I mean, who knows? I mean, if they don't get a seat next year, and he has an extremely good rally championship, there's probably every chance that he could come back.
Yeah, very true. I think, like I say, it's going to depend very much on what he does in the rally in this year. If he proves in the rally and that he is capable of withstanding the forces and can do what is demanded of him in the car, I think there is a good chance that he will come back. So, like I say, it's probably too early to say yet whether he will or he won't come back, depending on the state of play as it is now. But like I say, if he has a very, very good year in rally, that's definitely a very good sign that he may come back next year.
Okay, so the next article on the agenda is the fact that Bernie has apparently been commented as stating that he thinks a 22 race season is possible. Obviously, there are only 19 races this season due to New Jersey pulling out. And I think we've got possible races in Russia and South Africa.
Yep, that is correct. It was supposed to be a 20 race season this season, but like I say, it's dropped down to a 19 race because they've had to postpone New Jersey. They've not cancelled it. It's not going away. It will be here next year, providing it's ready. So we should be back to a 20 race season next season. But maybe if Bernie has his way, like I say, the possibility of 22 with, I think it was Moscow and Cape Town were the two venues that were bandied about as being the possible venues.
I know we've had the South African Grand Prix long ago. Well, from our perspective, I think it is. And I'm not too sure if we've ever had a Russia one, have we?
I don't think so, no.
I mean, there's obviously potential. There's a whole new market there, probably is what Bernie's thinking about. But I suppose thinking from more of a practical level, you obviously have, we can see, for example, for this week, you have Australia in one weekend, and then you have Malaysia straight after. So we know the teams can turn it around that quickly, but I'm wondering what the practicalities are of having what would essentially be an extra 3 races on the calendar going forward when you think about the preparation time, the development cycles. I mean, would it have a large impact with the 3 additional races?
Yeah, I believe so. I think, if we look at it as 2 additional races, I think a lot of the teams, the general consensus among the teams, and I think
gear up for 20, do they?
Yeah, I think I think it was Christian Horner who said in an interview last season that 20 races, all of their staff at the current levels are running at 100% to get 20 races in. So they're going to either have to take on more staff or change something the way they do, as far as the teams are concerned, for 22 races. And of course, we only get a 3-month break during the season between the start of one and the end of another. So as well, if they have to try and fit possibly an extra month in there as well, that gap in the mid-season gets shorter and shorter as well. So that may be something else they need to consider as well, unless they're just going to squeeze it in somewhere else in the middle of the season.
It's a good point, because I suppose that where I was going was, I suppose I'd be more concerned about the team's capacity to finish off one season and then focus on another. I mean, we know the teams make a call, or we know some teams make a call at a point in the season and say, you know what, it's a lost cause. It can happen obviously whilst they're still racing in the previous season, but I suppose I think there is a large impact where you can say, well, having a much shorter winter break, if that's an option that they could do by shrinking that time, that the teams wouldn't necessarily have that development schedule. But, on the other hand, they're all in the same boat, aren't they? So I guess, whilst some teams could complain about that justifiably, I think, if everyone's in the same boat, then you just got to manage around it. It's a bit like a regulation, isn't it, that is consistent across all teams. I'd be quite interested to see what the take-up is with these countries as well. I mean, I'm not sure if there's any idea currently about when we may have answers for those. I would have thought we'd have to know pretty late on into this season.
Yeah, I think I'd be quite surprised if we see anything announced officially before this season is actually finished. I expect it to be in the season break when there's any official confirmation, if any, of these races coming next year.
Yeah, I mean, also I'm wondering as well. I mean, obviously with Petrov being Russian as well, whether that could facilitate him entering the Grand Prix circuit again.
Yeah, possibly. So he done a lot of campaigning for the Moscow Grand Prix, or the possibility of a Moscow Grand Prix, while he was in the race. Well, I think it was why he was racing with Renault Lotus, as it was then, that he'd done a lot of campaigning for the Moscow one. It all went a bit quiet on that, and maybe this might be a little bit of a resurgence. And like I say, the possibility of Russia themselves may actually be more interested if he is back in the sport, but who knows. So, talking about the possibility of a person coming back to the sport, the next news story is a company that may possibly be coming back to the sport. We've got Honda returning a possible return for Honda as an engine supplier, and the possibility that McLaren may be using them as their supplier in 2015.
Yeah, it seems that with the changes of regulations in 2014, or it's been suggested that this is the case, Honda obviously feel that they have more of a technical, higher understanding of how to make better efficiencies with the cars, and obviously with the different energy recovery systems that are looking to be put in place with the engines as well next season. And I do wonder when they're actually going to announce that. Would that be? Do you think that's something which could be sort of towards the end of this season?
Possibly not, because I'm not sure that we're going to see them next year unless there's any team that take them up on the offer. Because from my understanding of it so far, with especially McLaren, they'll be looking at getting Honda on board in 2015 if they do, rather than 2014. So McLaren at the minute are sort of tentatively signed up with Mercedes for next year.
Oh, right. So it's not sort of something that they have to have as a done deal ready for the following season.
No, I don't believe
it's possible,
so.
But they're hedging their bets until the season after, just to see if Honda really do have perhaps a product that they can take on board, or that even Honda want to get back into the sport.
I think probably at the minute we're probably in the contract negotiation stages. So until they have a team that are definitely going to go with them, I don't think they're going to announce anything. So as soon as they've signed a deal to supply somebody, we'll hear fairly soon afterwards that they will be the engine supplier for X team the next season.
Yeah, well, we should certainly watch out for that. Okay, so the next news article is the announced Vodafone and McLaren split from next season onwards.
Yep, that's correct. Vodafone won't be taking up their majority sponsorship deal with McLaren. Well, I think it's technically a partnership between the two. So McLaren have said they've got new partners lined up already, but they're not going to announce anything till the end of this season. So we'll have to wait to see on that one. But what do you think, that Vodafone don't want to be in F1 anymore, or possibly that they think McLaren are a team on the decline?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, really. I mean, I'd probably say it's probably a little bit of both. Reason why I say that is because obviously, it could be said that with Lewis leaving, he's widely renowned as one of the fastest drivers, I think, certainly on the Grand Prix circuit,
and definitely a very big PR asset as well for the team.
Absolutely. I mean, we obviously know that Lewis obviously doesn't like too much of that, or certainly to the amount that McLaren wanted him to do. So
I think even with his presence at the team was enough to bring. Because I don't think he'd done a lot for Vodafone. I'm pretty sure I didn't really see him in the adverts like we did for various like sort of Santander and those type ones. But
yeah.
It's
sort of why.
yeah, it seemed a bit quiet bit quieter for the stuff they'd done for Vodafone, apart from obviously having it on the cars. But I think just his presence in the team was a big PR asset. So they might find they lose a few more of the sponsors for that very reason.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also been reported, I believe, in the Times, looking at some of the online articles, that one of the other reasons it's been rumoured has been as a result of the Bahrain challenges they had, obviously last season, where a lot of teams were and are basically about whether to join or be part of the circuit. It's a tricky one, because if you don't, you then potentially lose out, don't you? And it was a bit of a rock and a hard place for a lot of the teams. Whether there's any truth on that, who knows? But yeah, that's certainly something which has been bandied around as one of the other potential reasons. So we will have to look forward to see what the next sponsor is going to be. I think could be anyone.
Probably a change of paint as well. So unless they get someone else who's predominantly red in their logos and colours, they'll be repainting that McLaren slightly differently.
Yes, and I wonder whether they'll actually go back to white as well now. They'll stick with the chrome, but who knows?
Or I don't know, maybe they could go for Coca-Cola just to keep the silver on red theme alive and not change it too much. Okay, so next on the list is the future of the TV coverage. No particularly huge stories here to come up with. It's not changing or anything like that, but there's a few smaller stories that I've seen and read on various different sites about the viewers decreasing over the years. I think it was actually written down that in the previous BBC years, 4 or 5 years or so, since about 2008, there was a rise year on year of viewers, which then suddenly dramatically fell back when the Sky coverage took over.
Well, which is interesting. I think I think there's obviously a bit of a concern in the sport at the moment. Obviously, with costs having to be kept very. Obviously a lot of teams having to keep a close eye on the costs about what they do about that, because obviously it's very much about the sport is very much about getting interest, getting a large fan base globally as high as possible. So you have that balance, I think, between potentially additional revenue. I'm thinking of based on the license fees if they find that the free to air channels are no longer willing or can't pay the continued or increase fees to actually televise the sport.
I think one of the deals that Bernie had put in place when they were doing it, actually negotiating the contract and the teams were involved in the changeover, was that any lost revenue that the teams weren't getting through advertising would be made up from the money that Sky were actually paying to F1 as well. So they were going to get a share of it to make up for the loss in advertising revenue.
I see. So it acts like a bit of like a stopgap.
Yeah, the money they're getting the same amount. I think it was sold to the teams as you'll be getting the same amount of money, but from just from different places.
Right. Yeah, and of course, I suppose at the expense of the fans turning away. I mean, I honestly couldn't understand why that would be, aside from the fact that it's more money than otherwise people would pay for, and in times like this at the moment where things are quite tight for a lot of people, I guess that's having a large factor. And of course, it's a global, more global recession than I think we've ever had for decades. So it is going to have that impact. But I wonder whether it's going to be a continued impact. It'd be interesting to see whether that fall continues.
I've got a slightly sort of other theory on that as well. With because obviously F1 being classed as a sport, it isn't a sport in the conventional sense of the sport. A lot of people, because especially this year, Sky have changed it now, so you don't have to have the HD, or you don't get it with the HD package like you did last year. You have to have from now on. You have to have the Sky Sports package, and of course that's a lot more expensive than the normal HD package. And my theory is that a lot of people have said a lot of people will be saying now, so we may even be seeing a further decline than we did last year. I'm not going to pay the extra and subsidise with all the channels that I don't want just to watch Formula One. And I think that's going to become even more apparent when people say, I don't want to subsidise football, I don't want to subsidise whatever else starts, whatever else is on there. All I want is F1. And it seems to me now a little bit of a farce that they've made an F1 channel but are bundling it in with all the rest of the channels. It may as well just be on one of those channels now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's time will tell about what the true impact is, but I think they do need to keep a very close eye on it in the near future, because I mean Formula One is very much I think obviously an armchair sport. It's not necessarily something that each one of us can actively be involved in.
Yes.
Aside from going down the local karting area, which is a little bit different, isn't it? Really, let's face it. So yeah, well, it's very much dependent on home viewers and people going to the races. And I think if they price themselves out, we just have to have a very close idea about how that's going to impact the sport in the future, and hopefully it won't have too much of a large one, obviously, because we don't want the sport to decline.
That's it. And I think that they're going to suffer some big damage, potentially suffer some big damage with this bundling of sports and putting it in with everything else. I think is a problem. And what I would hope is if the viewership does decline more now because of this, that the wheels will be put in motion for the FIA themselves to actually do something about the TV rights and maybe offer a direct streaming service from the FIA themselves. So we get all the feeds possibly, and maybe you get all the feeds with no commentary. Maybe the FIA provide a commentary as well. Maybe you can, I don't know, mix and match a little bit, have pay a bit of money to the FIA to have a direct feed like the TV companies get at the moment, like Sky get, the BBC get when they're covering it, and then maybe we can just listen to the commentary from the BBC or whoever.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, because I always associate it, I suppose, because he's such a enigmatic figure that Bernie has the keys to this. But so I mean, would it even be possible for the FIA to do something like that? Do they give him the license to then sell on? Is that how it works, or is it something which they can say, well, actually, we're keeping some of this back to enable us to get direct to our fans via online now and via our own mobile and internet streams?
I think that would be pretty much something that'd be governed in contract negotiations, because I'm pretty sure that when Sky negotiated it with the FIA themselves and the sport as a whole, there would have been a clause in there that they couldn't do something like that. But it may come to the point when licenses come up for renewal for the sport that they may have to start looking at that, because the viewers have dropped off so dramatically. To get people back in the door, as it were, they may have to start thinking about offering another stream. And if the BBC can't afford the rights, that's obviously not an option. So the FIA may have to start looking at something then, just because the numbers may drop off so dramatically by then.
Yeah, we should certainly have to keep an eye on that, certainly throughout the season and in forthcoming seasons.
Yeah, so it is definitely a worrying trend when you see the figures dropping off so badly after, I think it was quoted as 4 or 5 years of a steady increase, to suddenly fall back to the beginning of where the viewer numbers were at the beginning of those 4 years. So like I say, it's a slightly worrying trend, and hopefully it won't have too much of a detrimental effect on the sport. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the first part of our regular agenda for the podcast, and the next part will be our race predictions. Okay, so we'll start off with Cole's predictions. Who have you got down for pole on Saturday?
Okay, yeah, I've got old Sebastian Vettel on pole. I think Red Bull looks, pretty consistent in testing so far, and I think they've done a bit of sandbagging. So I think they're going to show their true colours, and I think they're going to try and blast Vettel out from the front.
Yeah, I think Gary Anderson also said as much on the BBC website, that he come to the conclusion that Red Bull were carrying far more fuel in all of the testing than any other team as well. Okay, so that's that one. Who is your prediction for the winner on Sunday?
Yeah, I'm actually going to go with Alonso for a couple of reasons. I think, firstly, whilst the Red Bull is super quick, a little bit concerned about the tyre wear at the moment. Certainly looks like to be graining on the softer compounds at the moment. And I'm going to go with the fact that Ferrari would be a little bit better on their tyre management, and I can see Alonso creeping back up to Vettel after a little while into the race, and ultimately overtaking him. So that's my pick.
So Ferrari to have the solid strategy that they had last year.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's better put, yeah. Okay, so back at you. What's your predictions for pole?
I think I'm going to have to go again with the same as you on that one. Take the safe option and go for Vettel, because of course no one's really looked to challenge him in any kind of qualifying up until this point. So until somebody does, I think it's just the status quo as normal, I think.
Okay, but what's your predictions for the winner?
Okay, I'm going to try a little bit of a different one here, because as of this time, the weather's looking a bit mixed. I think it's 50-50 for whether it's going to be rainy or sunny, which is quite unusual for Australia. So I'm going to take the risk that it is going to rain over the weekend, and for that very reason, I'm going to go for Button, being the master in the changeable conditions. So although we only have 2 hosts of the podcast, quite obviously, we've got a third prediction as well, which happens to be a 4-year-old child that we've managed to rope into the show as well. And the reason that we've decided to add this in, I'll tell you the story. I know you've heard it before, but I'll tell it for everybody who's listening. And if I miss anything, you can fill in the gaps for me, as you may remember something that I didn't. Basically, it started last year at Hungarian Grand Prix, where just as a little fun game, normally I ask my daughter as well to make a prediction for the race with me as well, of who's going to be fastest and who's going to win the race. So for Hungary last year, she predicted Lewis Hamilton to be on pole. She didn't watch the qualifying. She wasn't that interested, or she didn't see the result. So I didn't tell her who was fastest. And after that, I said to her, "Okay, so who do you think now is going to win the race?" And she said, "I don't don't know. And I said, oh, don't you think Lewis Hamilton's going to win the race because you said he was going to be the quickest? And she said, oh no, he was going to be the quickest, but she said from the start, on the first corner, someone's going to crash into him, his wheel will come off, and then he won't be able to continue anymore. So, of course, as we both know, Lewis Hamilton went on to win Hungary with no incident.
But of course, that's what happened at Spa.
As identically as she explained it for her prediction for Hungary, come shockingly and horribly true at Spa, and that was as soon as Grosjean hit Hamilton. That was my exact thoughts of what went through my mind of what she said, and it actually did send a chill down my spine. So sort of on and off, I've asked her, and she's got a funny knack of guessing the right answers as well. So I thought it'd be a nice little sort of twist to the predictions to put her predictions in as well. Right, so I'll go over now and we'll get Jess's predictions for the qualifying and the race. So Jess, who's going to be fastest on Saturday?
Lewis and Vettel.
And who do you think's going to win the race on Sunday?
Lewis Hamilton. Who's going to be quickest on Saturday?
Sebastian Vettel.
Okay. He's going to win on Sunday.
Jenson Button.
Okay, the next of our regular sections will be the race roundup section, and obviously what we'll do is we'll cover the qualification section first. So, yeah, Tony, what's your view over how the qualification went?
Very tiring.
Well, same for me as well, but I was kind of thinking about the drivers more than anything.
When it finally got going, it wasn't too bad. I think Q1 was probably one of the most exciting qualifying sessions that I think I've seen that I can remember in a long time. So that was very, very exciting because
Lots of spinnies and crashes and
that's it. Yeah. Won't they make it? Can Hamilton get his car into reverse and back onto the track? Has he beached it? Will Massa get back to the pits? And will one of the Caterhams get back while it's surfing along?
Why do you think they've particularly struggled here? Because I know obviously wet weather is obviously naturally treacherous, etc. I know, but I was actually quite surprised by the amount of crashes that occurred in that first Q1.
Yeah, I did read an article earlier on that I believe may have explained it or go some way to explaining it. And what they said was because they very rarely get rain on the circuit at Australia, what they tend to do is where they've got the white lines, because of course it's a street circuit, where they've got the normal white road markings, a lot of places, if there's going to be rain, they will either burn them off or will make sure that it's part of the course, that it's not done. But in Australia, and don't quote me on them being the only ones that do it, others may, they paint black paint over the white paint instead of removing the paint altogether. And of course, as we know, a little bit of moisture on the track, like the same as the painted curbs, as soon as they put wheel onto those, that's when they're getting in. So there's going to be little treacherous spots sort of dotted basically throughout the track as they go round.
Yeah, especially with in Melbourne, obviously I can see the cars really pushing to the limits in terms of the wheels on the edge, and from what it seems like, they seem to be touching that. So that's a good point. They seem to be just going over those painted lines, which would cause them to slip. Of course, you know.
Yeah, I mean, cutting on that one as well, and I think we saw as well. It was enough that a lot of people were doing that because maybe they were the paint or the black lines painted over the white lines to cover up the road markings because they were dotted around all over the track. That may have been putting people out of shape a little bit and then causing them to run out wide on certain corners because of that as well.
Oh yeah, so they're getting pushed out and then they're getting.
It's putting them offline as they're going in because they're losing traction maybe for a millisecond, but of course with the little area of margin you've got in Formula One, it's enough to send them off of the track or send them off of line, which is then enough to send them off track.
But of course, with Q1 there as well, and Nico Rosberg in both Q1 and Q2, albeit something like a 16 odd hours difference, but he was really storming through those first two sessions.
Yes, looking very good for Mercedes in the wet. It's either Nico Rosberg he was airing on the side of a wet setup, so maybe he had a wetter setup than Lewis Hamilton, or maybe he just had the car dialed in better. Of course, without knowing the ins and outs, we can't tell that, but it does look in general Mercedes to be a very, very good car in the wet, and possibly that it coped with the cold and the qualifying conditions as well, because of course the track temperature dropped a hell of a lot from the day before.
It did, yeah, and I think that he was not just faster, he was significantly faster than everybody else. So I think if there's something they can take, or a big learning curve that they can take from Melbourne, it's actually, whatever the settings he's got there, providing it suits Lewis's driving style, that they really do need to, I think, share some knowledge there as to how that works so well for Nico. Yeah,
I think so. And I think possibly with Lewis as well. I think I personally would give him about 3 races before I judge what he's doing, because of course he's although the cars are both brand new to both of them, it's more of an evolution for Rosberg than it is for Hamilton, because coming from McLaren, I think just in general that car had more downforce, so he's now got to sort of unlearn where he can and can't lift off before, where he would have. There's probably places now where last year he would have kept a car planted where he can't do that this year. So I think there's a little bit of readjusting, sort of going almost backwards slightly for him. But of course, that leads on quite nicely to McLaren actually, who struggled dreadfully in qualifying.
They did, yeah, and they're not making they're not trying to look at a silver lining either. They are very downbeat themselves as well by the looks of it. And
yes, and they come out quite openly in all interviews and said the car just wasn't up to it.
No, absolutely, which is I think is a big worry, because I think the first and foremost, I don't think they actually know from what they've suggested that they know why, which is I think is the biggest problem. I think once you know why a car is underperforming a certain way, you can then put steps to mitigate it. But I think the big issue for McLaren at the moment is that they don't seem to know, and that's a big problem. What certainly seemed to come out recently is that they've obviously said that this car is more revolution rather than evolution, and that's obviously that comes with risks, and it certainly seems like that's not quite paying off for them at the moment. But theory is that they could develop the car easier going forward into the rest of the season.
Yeah, I think that was a quote from Jenson Button where he said the car may look the same on the outside, but it's a very different beast underneath. So it quite clearly is, and it's not maybe not quite performing to the level they were hoping at this point of the season already.
Okay, and a shocking qualifying for Sergio Perez.
Yeah, indeed. Q2 was looking very painful for him. They pulled him in for a set of slick tyres to see if he could make make an early jump to slicks to try and get the jump on everybody else. But as soon as he went out, I don't know whether it was because he had a problem, but he did later report that he had what he thought was a rear puncture in one of the tyres, which is why he came back in for a second set. But I don't know whether that was the cause straight away, but he just seemed to be all over it. He couldn't keep it on the track. He couldn't keep it for the racing line. He seemed to have no grip at all. And I would have thought that as soon as McLaren had seen that, they would have brought him back in and put him on a set of intermediates again rather than another set of slicks. So I'm thinking they possibly made an error there in where they could have secured something, maybe just squeaked him into Q3 if they had played that a bit better.
So Button made a call himself, did he not, a little bit beforehand, if my memory serves me correctly, to sort of make that?
Yeah, he did. He wanted to go back from the slicks back to the intermediates, whereas Perez stayed out on the slicks for the rest of the first session. Yeah,
and I suppose it's one of those things, isn't it? Just a little. It's easy to say in hindsight, but yeah, just a little bit too early, and he just wasn't then able to make up the time when it was always the wrong time, wasn't it? He came out early with those tyres by the looks of it, and then was sliding around everywhere. He then had to go in and stick inters on, but by the time he'd stuck the inters on, it seemed like the track had finally dried out to accommodate the slick tyres. So, yeah, it's I would say a little bit in McLaren's defence that is obviously a tricky one to call, and it's just unfortunate with Sergio that it just happened to be on his maiden race with McLaren.
Yeah, I think the problem was they had nothing to lose by taking the risk. They were already doing so badly. They could afford to throw slicks at both drivers to see what they could do with them. So, and it may have been the decision was probably clouded by the fact that Perez. I still don't know whether he did have a rear puncture or not, but he was very much under the impression that he had a rear puncture, and that's why he called to come back in for a change of tyres. So it may be that was the reason that they decided, okay, he had a puncture, that's why he had a problem. Send him out on another set of slicks and maybe he'll be okay. Maybe his sliding about all over the track was purely due to the fact that he had a puncture.
And going into the Q3, we saw the Red Bulls lock out the front row. They really did switch it on as the track dried out. Lewis did an excellent time in the Mercedes.
Yeah, I think that was very good. I did think he was going to actually split the Red Bulls at one point as well.
Yeah, but he managed to split the Ferraris and the Red Bulls. So yeah, I think it sort of lined itself up for an interesting race.
Yeah, definitely. And if anything like the conditions were for qualifying, if that carries on during the race, it is going to be even more interesting still. And talking of splitting the Red Bulls and the Ferraris as well, the other one to look at as well was for the first time, well, not for the first time, but for first time in a little while, Massa out-qualifying Alonso.
Yes, Fernando, Massa is faster than you. It's certainly the case at the moment. Quite a surprise. But it shows
not by much, it must be said, by a very, very small
No.
margin. But like I say, it all counts in F1. So
Yeah, that is important to note. Yeah, I mean, you look at the reasons why, and we could find it's an opposite story for Malaysia. But very interesting, and it does beg to differ. Our original podcast, when we spoke about team orders at Ferrari, about what that then means for either the race and going forward. You know, what rules do they have in place where they determine who is the number one driver for the season. So it should certainly be interesting after the result of this race to see how their strategy changes in the coming races.
So they made the promise that they're going to back the leading driver. Now let's see if they hold to that promise.
Absolutely. Okay, so another situation I think was quite notable in qualifying was the Caterhams finishing behind the Marussias.
Yes, both Mauritius out-qualifying both Caterhams, and of course even more of a not a bigger story than that, but to add to that story as well, that's two rookie drivers in a back team at Marussia not finishing at the back of the grid, actually beating Charles Pic, who was obviously in F1 before, and Van der Garde, who's another rookie, but the surprising thing there was Charles Pic, the only one of the four not to be a rookie, finished dead last.
Yeah, so I mean that won't do his confidence any good, I don't think. But it's one of those things with the team. I suppose you go in a new team, you take a risk, don't you? And I suppose his thinking is Caterham have got a bit more backing, but there may be a Renault relationship there. That's not good. I think if you're there on your team, you'll want to see the closing of the pack into the midfield. You want to start challenging with the Williams, the Force Indias, the Toro Rossos of this world. You do not want to be fighting the same team you've been fighting for the last couple of seasons. Obviously with HRT going out as well. So, being last is more significant as well this time round for teams that are struggling to advance.
I think as well, you don't want to see the team that you were, I wouldn't say comfortably beaten, but mostly beaten every race last season, then coming out ahead of you straight out of the blocks. I
mean, credit to Marussia on the flip side. They've certainly, you can see they certainly try to work as hard as they can. Their development process, especially with Kerrs, was a lot later than Caterham's, all by full season. So I know this is what I said in the last podcast, that arguably last season Marussia were obviously nipping on the heels of Caterham all the time, and maybe had they had Kerrs last season, that would have been enough then to have pushed them ahead of Caterham even at that stage. Yeah.
Right, so that's the big news from qualifying done and covered, so that will move nicely onto the race.
Yeah, so I don't think it was a classic, but it was certainly intriguing, obviously being the first race. So I mean, looking at the start, obviously you had Nico Hülkenberg out instantly via I believe it's a fuel system.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, that was always quoted actually as a fuel system problem.
Start itself, I mean, if I just summarise from my point of view, obviously you had a fantastic start by Alonso.
Both Ferraris.
yeah, exactly, and Massa had a good one as well. Webber seemed to have wheel spun a little bit, which obviously cost him massively. I think Lewis seemed fairly consistent. I know he had a couple of instances last season where he struggled with the start in the McLaren. And then when the race was underway and I saw Vettel shoot away, I thought, well, this is going to be a bit processional. But yeah, it seemed that didn't turn out to be the case. But what do you think of the start?
I pretty much go with the same as that. Say, very, very surprised on just how quick those Ferraris got away. That was that was very, very quick. And had it not been for the three drivers in front of them, sort of darting around for grid position and fighting amongst themselves, if the Ferraris had a clean run, I think they may have both got through and been gone themselves on that first corner. But like I say, because they were all sort of jockeying for position into the first corner, that slowed him up a little bit, but it didn't take him long. I think it was about 3 corners, and Alonso was already... Massa was right up there with Alonso behind him as well. So
yeah, and obviously when Vettel got the clean air, he really did start to pull away. But I suppose for the neutrals' point of view, it was certainly interesting to then see as the track continued to dry out and rubber in. Ferraris were able to rein him in effectively this time round. Certainly seems like the Red Bull suggests to me that the Red Bull eats those tyres a bit more this season. But I think a lot of cars will do, just because of the changes to the Pirelli tyres as well. But they seem to have developed that, and it seems to have been working against Red Bull's initial race strategy of stick Vettel on pole and get him as far ahead as humanly possible at the beginning.
Yeah, so I think as well, from this race, it's hard to take any kind of standard of what the cars are going to be like. So I think just the conditions were so different, so changeable. It was almost like a wild card of a race. It was a bit of a potluck of what was going to happen at some points of view, because with the track temperature being that so much less than you would generally expect a track to be, even on a normal circuit, let alone a hot one like Australia normally is, the tyres obviously weren't getting up to temperature, and a lot of cars were eating them because they couldn't get them up to temperature. So
if I can understand then the tyres themselves, so obviously when I do believe obviously there's an operating temperature with Pirelli,
there's a window of temperature. So below that window, the tyres will start to grey, and they'll basically be grated against the tarmac, and obviously too hot, you'll start to overheat them and actually melt the compound, because basically what is supposed to happen is, as the tyres heat up, the operating window makes the consistency of the tyre go almost like a chewing gum sort of type thing, so for that sort of adhesion to the road. So let's say too hot and they'll melt it, too low and they'll just be sort of grating layers off of those, which I think we saw Satil have major problems with at the end. I think they switched back to the full soft tyres, and I think he had completely destroyed the rears in about 3 laps.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a valid point into the rest of the season as well. As whilst we saw Red Bull and the tyres at the moment struggle, there's every opportunity in the next couple of races, if the Red Bulls get a more effective operating temperature window, that they could still pull away and manage their tyres better. The whole car could just be designed on operating temperature, which simply isn't normal at the moment. It was particularly cool yesterday, and a little damp.
I think that this is Newey's whole concept. I think if you look back at previous history of Adrian Newey cars, he designs a car for the balance. He won't design to win under any extreme. He'll design to win slap bang in the middle of conditions. So they will win more races as a whole, rather than dominate the races that they're good at, or they're specifically good at. So today it was obviously slightly too cold for the Red Bull. They will maybe appreciate a track temperature of maybe I don't know, just slightly hotter possibly, because it wasn't a freezing track, but it was definitely cold by normal race conditions.
And I think what's particularly interesting that we saw, and I must admit I don't understand this to a greater deal. It could just been a strategic error, but obviously with Massa going extremely well, we saw Fernando undercut him effectively during the race, and that worked. That seemed to work wonders for him eventually. And when Massa did the same little while afterwards, he ended up going out in traffic.
Yeah, it seems to be quite a weird decision to bring him in when they actually did bring him in, purely because of the fact they must have known the tyres were starting to degrade. They should have been covering Vettel for the lead, and they didn't actually do that. They took Alonso in first to go for the undercut, but like I say, instead of Massa following Vettel in, he then done extra laps, and I think was told by Rob Smedley, now is the time to show what you can do, something similar to that. But of course, with fading tyres and not a lot of hope of going out and putting in blisteringly fast laps, he was always going to be caught and overtaken by the people behind him. So maybe a tactical error. I don't know. Maybe they did honestly think there was more life in their tyres than there actually were.
Yeah, and I suppose it's a bit of an experimental stage at the moment, isn't it, as well? I think the way the race panned out, I think we'll just have to see. I think the next few races, I think we'll start to get a better idea over, and the team will certainly get a much better idea, obviously, about how to manage these tyres going forward. But I think the biggest worry I do have is these super softs and how quickly they burn away. Now, okay, I know we need to take into consideration that it's because it's cool. These super softs may be designed for hard abrasive tracks that are very warm and humid. But yeah, as you mentioned earlier with Satil, it's a big concern. If we find that these tyres aren't going to last even so much of a handful of laps, you could find that everyone's going to be qualifying on them if it's a dry qualifying. But then pit within the first couple of laps of a race just to get shot of them.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah, like I say, I think you run the risk of these becoming qualifying tyres and nothing more.
That's right, and as teams tend to do, I feel I've seen over the last few years, when a change like this happens, they'll all just tend to mitigate towards a strategy which best supports them for the ultimate race results. So you could find that if a couple of teams do it, and it seems to work, then everyone will start doing it, and it'll become this strange queue up in the pit lane.
Yeah, so I think we saw that last season where there was the smaller teams, like the top of the midfield running teams. Force India comes to mind quite a lot, where because of the way the tyres were going and the tyre management, they wouldn't actually do any runs in Q3.
Yep, that's exactly the example I was thinking of. That kind of thing we could see now as a result. But as I say, time will tell. But yeah, I mean, another team which certainly seemed to not quite have a handle on the tyres in my view were Mercedes. I think after their blisteringly quick qualifying laps, both in the wet and I think obviously Hamilton did particularly well to split the Ferraris and the Red Bulls. They certainly suggested that they were competitive. But when it came to the race, they seemed to fall off a bit.
I think as well, there was probably I wouldn't call it a strategic error by Mercedes, but I think they based their strategy around the cars going, or the car as it turned out, as Nico Rosberg had to retire. But they planned the cars to go a bit longer than they were actually able to do on the tyres. Because at one point I heard on Hamilton's radio that they were still expecting him to push, and this was the time to push, and he basically said, "I'm already going flat out." So
I wonder if that is, I see what you're saying though. I wonder if that is a strategic area in it a little bit, because I suppose everyone's learning, aren't they?
I think the problem is in normal circumstances, everybody is still learning in the first race of the season. It's just time for everything to bed in, everyone to get used to everything. But to have that then coupled with the extreme conditions or changeable conditions that we had, I think that just some of the times out there for things like that, for strategy calls, I think it did make it a bit of a lottery.
I think what I'm probably struggling with, and of course it's so easy to say this in hindsight now that obviously we can see that they did have issues with the tyres, is that I do wonder whether they should have pitted Rosberg and Lewis almost like complementing the other cars, almost like looking to attempt to undercut them, or pitting roughly around the same time as they did. And I wonder what sort of impact that could have had to Lewis's race, because he ultimately finished, but to both the drivers.
I think that would have been a hard call for them to make, because they would have had to have committed to that from very early on. And I think because they were going for a different strategy, they knew they weren't the fastest. I think they were looking to do basically what Kimi did for the win. I think they were looking to two-stop and hoping to look after their tyres, and the car just couldn't look after the tyres like they needed it to. And I think once they had committed to the two-stop, they had to change very late on, which then didn't allow them any room for manoeuvre, basically. So their hand was forced when they had to come in for that third stop.
I suppose what the concern is, if you're a Mercedes fan or a team which at the moment is also struggling with tyres, is that but you basically have the chassis design, and you have the aerodynamic upgrades which you can bring throughout the rest of the season. But if a car struggles with the tyre degradation, I suppose it depends on what's causing that degradation, both either when it's cool or hot.
If we knew exactly, we would. I'm sure we'd be hired by the Mercedes team to sort it out.
Oh yeah, if only. But I suppose my point is, I do wonder about what control they do have over this. So they can say, well, okay, the tyres aren't great in the cold. Is it because it was cold and because it wasn't in its operating temperature, or do we have a fundamental issue here which we've got to try and work on? Because this is potentially only going to get worse if it's something which isn't a direct result of the unique conditions of the Melbourne race.
Yeah, I think this is the problem, that nothing can be drawn from this race as to who really stands where, just because it was so changing. The conditions were so outside of what the normal would have been. We can't really read anything into how the cars are going to react at the next race. And to be honest, I think we're going to have to take almost an average over the first three races to really see who's going to be where after that.
Especially if, you'd like to think it'd be good to see a variance of conditions across those three as well to get a gauge, or, a consistent, weather for the next 4 or 5 to then really see where they sit. I suppose the performance gauge is if it's dry and hot or warm. That is the sort of baseline for everyone to work towards. But do you think teams are able to turn a car that eats its tyres to one that doesn't?
Yeah, I believe so, and I believe probably the conditions from race to race as well, because we saw last season there was different teams that would be good on tyres one week and then would just destroy the next week. Lotus being an absolute prime example of that. I remember a few times where they thought they could get to the end of the race on tyres, only to have the tyres almost disintegrate with laps from the end.
Yeah,
Whereas and other times they would do maybe a quarter extra the distance that everybody else was doing on the same set of tyres.
Yeah, which will certainly be interesting in the following races to see what happens. So I mean, yeah, that leads us on really to the ultimate winner of the race, with it being Kimi Räikkönen. And I think, from my point of view, we've already discussed the conditions and the fact that it seems to have been a bit of a wild card race. Obviously, that will be proven either way in the coming races. But I think the one thing that stood out for me was obviously he was able to do a 2 pit stop race where everyone else has done 3. Factoring in the consideration that yes, it was quite cool. Was that a reason that the Lotus just happens to be able to manage its tyres better when it's that temperature now? But the biggest, I think, factor as well was with Kimi Räikkönen saying afterwards that he was able to go faster than when he needed to. I mean, with 10 laps to go, I don't know about you, but from my perspective, I was waiting for Alonso to catch him up very, very quickly, and he just didn't. He pulled away and nailed the fastest lap at the end of the race, and I think that's very significant. If Lotus can sort of, if that car is generally able to manage its tyres in an operating temperature or when it's cooler, like it's just generally a car that can manage the tyres, and that is how they've actually designed it. I think Lotus will be extremely competitive throughout the season because the other teams are going to have to compete with a team that can effectively do one less pit stop.
Oh yeah, that's it. And it was quite clearly maybe, like I say, they could get away with doing one less pit stop, but like I say again, the thing that amazed me today about what Kimi was doing, like he seemed to get faster on an old set of tyres as Alonso's new tyres were falling off.
Yeah.
So Alonso was either slowing down to save his tyres or maybe save fuel possibly. So it may not have been the tyres going off, it might have been fuel levels. But like we say, Kimi Räikkönen was then able to pull a bit more time out as soon as Alonso looked like he was going to actually start gaining on him.
I mean, could we look too much into this? I mean, based on the fact that we've already said about the fact that the conditions weren't necessarily ideal, or was it such a in terms of tyre management, such a dominant performance that we, no matter what the temperature is and how the Pirelli tyres work, this car is fundamentally able to manage its tyres much better and will, basically, I mean, how long is a typical pit stop? It can vary from race to race, but I mean, what are we talking? 15 seconds, 17 seconds?
I think it's anywhere. I think from the sort of the pit time in general is anything from I would probably say on average you would have it around 30 seconds would be the pit time.
So,
would be in to out.
Yeah.
So yeah.
In and out included, yeah. So I mean, you're almost talking. That's a massive chunk of time, especially when you're looking at cars which struggle behind other cars and being able to put a car out in front as well. That to be able to just have a car constantly out there and not have to do another pit stop, and as you correctly said already, keep that performance is a very interesting ingredient to it. Because I'll stick my neck out and say I still feel that, based on the Red Bulls and the Ferraris finishing positions, that I do get a feeling now that it's probably going to be between them. But Lotus, coming out of the blue here, it's effectively this race. Although they did qualify fairly well, it's certainly a good ingredient. And I think obviously with the Mercedes looking strong as well, they could always be there or thereabouts. And I'd certainly like to see those two teams get a couple of wins this season as a bare minimum.
I think as well, it's definitely very interesting again looking back at Kimi Räikkönen, because don't forget what was he almost famous for last season was being in the title race right to the end, having never won a race until he obviously won his race. So if he's already winning races or has the potential to already win a race at this stage in the season, all he really has to do is do that a couple of times and bring in podiums, and he'll do exactly what Alonso did last season with you don't always have to win to be right up there at the championship at the end. So combining what Raikkonen himself done last season with what Alonso done, if say Kimi Raikkonen only needed a couple more wins and he was right back in the hunt last year. So if he can be as consistent this year in the car, I'll put my neck on the line as well now and say I don't think the car's as quick as other cars around it. And obviously, time adjusted, he would have been about fourth or fifth when the pit stops coming. I would say, looking at it, he would have been fourth when if he'd had to do that extra pit stop. If he can do, but again, was he only coasting because he was out in front? Could he have pushed that harder and got a bit higher up the grid? But like I say, time adjusted, he would have been down. But of course, he could have been coasting, saving the fuel, saving the tyres should he have needed them. But like I say, what is going to be the key for him, I think, is if he can be as consistent than that, if he can win a couple of races this season and bring home lots of podiums and try not to finish, well, obviously he's going to try, but if he can manage to not finish below fifth and that sort of time, bring in the good points all the time, I think he's definitely going to look a strong contender at the end of the year.
Yeah, I think one of the key things from last season was that yes, consistency was very, very competitive in a strategic sense. Over that season, we did have a lot of unpredictability. We did have a lot of reliability concerns with some of the top teams. Now, obviously, for Raikkonen to be able to succeed in that vein, we would need something similar, this year. It's certainly possible. Looking at Mercedes have got a couple of faults which seem to appear in testing and appeared in the race as well. McLaren certainly look off the pace at the moment, so yeah, there's every chance that they can certainly make this into a much better season for them. And currently I'm envisaging Red Bull and Ferrari perhaps in a 1 and 2 situation. Take your pick on which one's 1, which one's 2 in terms of performance. And then you're probably looking at the Lotus and Mercedes, looking around behind them. I wouldn't even say McLaren or even after that. I think they are so far down at the moment, and that will be one of the bigger concerns for them. That you had the likes of Force India, and obviously their team principal say openly admitting afterwards, saying that yeah, we're taking advantage of this, whilst McLaren are in a bit of trouble. And yeah, I think that's kind of the way it's looking into the next couple of races. I think you could say Lotus and Mercedes obviously flirting with the podium positions. Until any other teams might need to catch up.
Yeah, I think that takes us on quite nicely to McLaren and the state of affairs there today for them as well. It's I say it's worrying finishing 11th and 9th. Oh, so not a complete disaster, but like I say, definitely not where they would want to be. And you would hope to see for their sake, for a front running team, having a big turnaround for the next race.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I know what you're saying in terms of it's not necessarily a disaster. They picked up points, but this is McLaren we're talking about. It's a team that has such obviously a high history, and obviously expects just to be at the front all the time. I think from that perspective, it is a bit of a disaster for them at the moment. But then, you've seen, as with Ferrari last year, a car that wasn't initially competitive in the first few races, but then improved considerably. And I think they've just got to try and, as you say, work out why the car isn't performing the way it is first and foremost. And then
that's going to be the thing that, like I say, that is going to be what's going to worry them the most, is that they don't know what the area, or from what they've openly come out and said to the media, they don't know what the area is. They don't understand where the problem is with this car, which would be definitely a worrying sign for me as a driver, that if I didn't know why the car was slow or didn't have some idea as to what was causing it.
Tricky start for Perez, definitely, as well.
Yeah, very, very much so.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of the other teams, obviously, I think with Sutil's strategy, he was leading. I believe he was leading about twice in 2 instances. He was genuinely leading the race. Obviously, we've already discussed the serious tyre wear, but I think they would be quite happy with where the positions that they still had ultimately towards the end. I must admit, I was surprised Sutil still finished ahead of Di Resta, because he was gaining, because
he was closing incredibly quick.
Yeah, he just had no tyres left, did he, Sutil? So I was quite surprised that he still came over the line ahead of Paul. So
I think it was a risk worth taking, because cars behind them were coming up quick when they moved on to the super softs, but I don't think anybody expected them to literally have gone off in the 3 laps or so that it took for Sutil's tyres to go off. So it could be, I know the commentators said that it was a bad call, it was a bad strategy to do that, but I think again they were already ahead of where they expected to be. It was worth the risk. They could have cemented that by getting the new fresh set of tyres, or they could have just looked to have been reeled in by the slightly faster teams behind them. But again, 7th and 8th. It's not. But I think if you said to them before the race, would you take 7th and 8th in these conditions, they would have quite happily taken that.
Yeah, they're taking your arm off, and I think that what would be very interesting challenge is to see if McLaren have continued issues, whether it's Force India that are looking to compete with them in that what would be effectively middle of the grid. And that's what we're talking at these days, aren't we? Really, in terms of the car numbers. So yeah, it's even surprising to suggest that at the moment. But if McLaren don't improve, that's certainly where they could find themselves for an extended period, I think. So
I think definitely the worrying thing for McLaren as well is that every problem they seem to have in testing at the very beginning of the season were all reliability issues. They had fuel pickup problems again, similar to what they had last season. So it doesn't look like they've sorted or completely got on top of the reliability, which is what was playing them up in testing this year. And now they've added to that the car isn't particularly fast. That's not looking a very good package to build on.
But plus, also, I suppose I do wonder the thought process behind building a revolutionary car, as they've described it, with effectively massive regulation changes next year. The other teams, I think, from my perspective, have taken the view of, well, you know what, we've only got another year left of these regulations in a similar form, so we're just going to evolve the car we've got to improve it. Whereas McLaren have suggested that they've taken a different route. Now, whether they can still take that route with the 2014 regulations in, I don't know for sure. But it does seem a strange strategy decision, really. With just one more year until there's vast differences in how the cars are built.
Yeah, you would have thought they would have seen it out with the old design before moving over to the new one. And
it was a fast car last year, wasn't it? That's the thing. It was a fast car, and perhaps it just needed a tweak and a bit more reliability, and you still have yourself a World Championship car.
Yeah, like I say, it seems to go for, and it does strike me as if now what's going to happen is they're going to go for a revolutionary car this year that they're not going to be able to transfer over to next year, and end up with then just yet another a revolutionary car next year. So.
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of the other teams, I'm thinking of. Obviously with McLaren, we'll see into next race if they can make any improvement. But Toro Rosso's seem to. I mean, honestly, they seemed absent to me. They didn't seem to. I mean, I don't think they had a good initial qualifying. I know, but what positions did they finish in?
They finished in 12th with Jean-Eric Verne, the other position they finished in was Daniel Ricciardo, but he retired, so that didn't finish. But they come out very, very strong. They looked very good at the start of the race and just faded very, very quickly.
That's a good point. Yeah, they did, and I suppose that I don't know what their targets are, but I'm sure as hell thinking Red Bull would want them further up the field so they can get a gauge on how the drivers can perform further up the field. So we shall see if they can make any improvements in the next races. What I'd like to talk about now actually is obviously at the back end of the field you have the Marussias and the Caterhams with Williams flirting around that area as well. I believe Bottas finished 14th, and obviously with Maldonado, who doesn't seem to like this track, with the errors again today.
Whatever gave you that idea with last year's little trip out into the wall, and then this year's retirement as well.
Yeah, and he was making a good deal of spinning the gravel around this time around, that's for sure. But I noticed that Marussia obviously are very competitive with Caterhams, and from my perspective, there's a perceived sense that Caterham have a bigger financial backing, but they certainly seem to be struggling to open that gap out between them and Marussia at the back.
Again, it's. But I think you're just chucking everything into the mix, and we can't really draw too many conclusions from it because they've got two rookie drivers. The car, again, I think they said that their car was revolutionary this year rather than the evolution, so a brand new car. But of course, Marussia last year was slightly hampered by the fact that they didn't have KERS, which they've got now this season. So we finished with looking at the four drivers for those teams. We've got Bianchi coming in 15th. For Marussia, so he's the highest finishing out of all of them. Then we've got for Caterham Pick coming in behind him. Then Max Chilton coming in the Cosworth behind him. So that is 14th, 15th, and 16th. 15th, 16th, and 17th, with the Marussia finishing the higher of all of those there. And I'm just looking down my list. 18th, Vandergaard came in the other Caterham. So if in general, if you're looking at it, it looks from the initial signs that Mauritius may be the very slightly stronger team out of the two.
They certainly seemed happier at the end of it, which is always telling because you can always get a sense of what their objectives were. And I think it was Max Chilton said that we're happy where we finished, and I think they'll be looking just to try and beat Caterham and any other teams that could get swallowed up going forward. But I think it should be interesting to see that battle there, really, because it does make you wonder about how the teams at the back can last being at the back until either they find themselves new owners or they improve. So we'll certainly watch with interest in the coming races.
And they're definitely, by today's performance, they definitely weren't knocking on the door of the midfield. So
yeah, exactly.
They were quite clearly still rooted to the back. So they've not made the big kind of strides that perhaps we'd hoping for, with maybe not beating, but maybe at least catching up with the back of the midfield round, which doesn't seem to have happened. So.
That's true. Yeah, it does make me wonder these teams how long they last then as a result. But hopefully they will, and we won't have even fewer teams in the season going forward. So
and maybe a slightly backwards move from Charles Pick as well, going from Mauritius to Caterham, obviously.
Yeah, good point. I'm sure he'll be wondering. I mean, I'm sure there's a Renault connection there somewhere, but. I'm sure he'll be wondering whether that was the best choice.
Yeah, because even if he wants, like say, if he wants to go there, he still wants to be in the fastest car wherever he's going. And to be honest, if I'd looked at it during the season break, I would have said that Caterham probably would have done something this season. But I know we can't draw too much from this race, but it's not looking likely this season. I would maybe peg Mauritius as very, very slightly ahead.
Okay, so to effectively wrap up then, obviously just in summary, it looked like a very, very interesting or surprise win by Kimi, I think. Especially in the manner in which he achieved it. You have
how dominant he was from
exactly
the final stretch.
Got the usual suspects on the podium effectively with Alonso and Vettel, and they kept the language clean this time round after very clear indications from the podium announcer. So. That was a relief, I think, but some slightly disappointing as well. But
relief for Martin Brundle, I think that was.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, but so certainly some interesting insights ready for Malaysia next week, and we'll certainly have a bit more information on how the teams are laying out after that race. Okay, and finally then, as part of our regular items on our podcast, we'd like to have a technology section just to discuss effectively some of the more complicated and complex items related to F1. So firstly, what I'm particularly interested in understanding is the double DRS, the rear wing stalling items that have become quite prominent in the last few months, obviously since testing, and obviously have a better understanding of what the subtle differences are between them, and what obviously the teams are now looking to employ into the season going forward.
Yeah, I think this is a bit of a clarification for us as well. What we kind of scratched the surface of this, I think, in the previous podcast, but didn't really go into any depth to really explain the difference. We kind of almost spoke about it as if people knew what we were referring to with active and double and various different things. So I think it'd be nice to take it back a step as well, especially for this podcast. They will do it in future podcasts, but to take this back a step and really break apart the DRS terminologies to hopefully give people a better understanding of them.
Sure.
So what I'll do is I'll break it down to the difference between the active DRS and the passive DRS, and what we mean by double DRS and just the normal single DRS. So to start with, we'll have a look at the difference between single DRS and double DRS. So basically, the single DRS would be just the rear wing be installed as that flap opens, which basically creates the air current to stall the back wing. So that would just be the single DRS, which all the teams run as part of the regulations. And what Mercedes and other teams, Lotus, I think, tried to do it towards the end of last season was double DRS, which basically meant last season they were trying to stall the front wing as well using the same technology. So they would actually stall the front wing as well as the rear wing. So that's the double and the single. The double DRS now has been banned. They're not allowed to stall any other part of the car. They're not allowed to stall any of the anything bar the rear wing now. So the front wing stalling that we had last year is banned. They're not allowed to do that. They can install extra devices, passive devices, which we'll talk about in a second, to stall the rear wing more, but they're not allowed, say, to now stall any other part of the car. It all has to be concentrated on that rear wing.
Right.
So hopefully that's the difference between double and single. The single is the back of the car effectively, and the double was they were doing both. They were stalling the front of the car and the back of the car, so effectively getting themselves all round less downforce rather than just less downforce at the rear. So then that will lead in then to active and passive. So again, as we briefly went into just then, the active DRS system is the one where the rear wing opens, so something is physically opening, as hence active, which is also connected to the brake. So when the drivers put the brake on, the rear wing will close. And the only part that is actually allowed to be active now is that flap in the rear wing of the car. They are not allowed to have any other part of the car moving, so they're not allowed to have flaps anywhere else in any way connected to that system. But what some teams have tried is what is known as passive DRS, which, going back into a bit more detail now, what Red Bull have tried to do this year, it's as the car gets up to a certain load or a certain speed, the difference in air pressures over different points of the car are then causing the rear wing to stall more. So as they accelerate down the straight, they can open their rear wing as normal with the active DRS. But then when they're hitting a certain speed, this extra area, or the passive DRS, is then also stalling the rear wing more. So you're then getting that extra effect of it. But the problem that the teams have had, and I've read that Red Bull in particular are the ones that have got most on top of it, but I don't think have still completely got it nailed and spot on to what they want, is the speed in which the rear wing stall engages and disengages isn't the same. So basically, as the cars are speeding up, the wing will start to stall at a certain point or at a certain speed. But when the car then decelerates back to that speed again, the stall isn't disengaging, making it very difficult to balance the cars for both accelerating and decelerating. But yeah, hopefully that should give you a bit of an overview. So for a basic summary, I say active and passive is something physically moving on the car, and passive is something just created by the general conditions the car goes through during the race. And the double and single, the difference is the single is the rear wing, and the double was where the front and the rear wing were both affected by the stalling effect of the wind going over the wings. So that brings us to the end of the podcast, and we just want to say thank you to everybody who's downloaded this episode of the Lights Out Racing podcast. We're currently still working on our website at the moment, but the forums are live, and you can get to the forums from our website address, which is www.lightsoutracing.co.uk. So go and sign up in the forums there, and you can get involved in the podcast. You can vote for the stories that you want to see featured in the next podcast, or just leave us some feedback or some ideas for the next podcast. It doesn't have to be a news item. We'll still listen, and if it's a good idea, we'll feature it on the podcast. As well as the forums, you can also follow us on Twitter as well. Our username is @LightsOutRacing. We did have a few people who contacted us after the last podcast with some feedback, which was really nice. Keep that coming. The feedback's always good, whether it's positive or negative. We'll listen to it both ways, and if it helps us improve the podcast, we will definitely do it. Also, as well, the people that did get in contact with us said they really like the outtakes. So again, this week I will leave you with our little selection of outtakes. So you've got paint on paint rather than tarmac.
Extra slippy.
Yeah. Maybe, like, say, the smaller, got to get more out of a smaller engine, possibly suits them.
Yes, absolutely.
It was going well, then we just lost it.
I was waiting for you to speak, and then waiting for each other to speak. That was good. We can pick up from that, I think. Right, so next on the news articles, it's the split between Vodafone.
That's a big split.
Anakin. It's a raspberry split, right?
Okay, so that'll be the end of... Oh, for sake.
Okay, so what are your predictions? Sorry, say that again. I need to explain what's your poll prediction, etc. Right, count me in again. Okay, the next of our... Start that again.
Okay, so that's the first part of the... what will be the regular... that wasn't what I was trying to say at all.